We've planned today's program in recognition that October is Cybersecurity Month. We are looking forward to an engaging and possibly thought-provoking program that looks at several facets of agency cybersecurity programs, hopefully answering the questions posed during your lunch discussions. Specifically, how are agencies operationalizing their security programs? How are agencies juggling agency priorities while still complying with federal mandates and standards? What other factors do agencies take into account when determining acceptable levels of risk for their mission-critical services? And what is the impact of disruptive, game-changing cybersecurity technologies for key areas of concern, like the cloud, mobility, social collaboration, and data? Without further ado, I am honored to introduce our distinguished moderator today, Tom Temin. Tom is a broadcaster, writer, editor, and consultant who brings more than 35 years of business-to-business media experience to clients in media and information technology products and services. Tom is co-host and managing editor of the Federal Drive with Tom Temin, which is a weekday morning news and talk program on Federal News Radio 1500 in Washington, D.C. Tom reports on and analyzes the latest news affecting the federal government and government contractors in the community in which they operate. He is a frequent industry speaker. Tom continues to comment on online columns discussing trends in government technology and management, topics on which his particular expertise is around. He also helps media companies refine their print and digital properties for greater market competitiveness, and he also helps IT vendors improve their internal and external communications with their white papers and other materials. Tom was the Executive Vice President and Editor-in-Chief for Post-Newsweek Tech Media, formerly known as the Washington Post Company. He was also responsible for editorial content in print and online of the award-winning Washington Technology and Government Computer News magazines, as well as the Government Leader and Defense Systems. As a journalist, he's covered a wide range of fields from basic industry to high-tech manufacturing. Government Computer News and Washington Technology were, during Tom's tenure, consistent winners of the Jesse H. Neal National Business Journalism Award and other business-to-business journalism awards. Also, GCN, if you didn't know, was the first magazine in its market to develop an actual web presence. 1995. Tom chaired the 2 editorial committees of the American Business Media Trade Association for 2 terms. He has an excellent reputation not only for his skills as an editor, but also as a public speaker and motivational leader. Tom holds a Bachelor of Science degree from RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and has completed the Stanford University Professional Publishing course. He's held various editorial positions and with local newspapers, including Massachusetts and in New Hampshire. A warm, a firm welcome, please, our distinguished moderator, Tom Temin.
Thank you. I'd actually forgotten most of that, to be honest, that all that happened. Thank you, Barry. And I guess the most important thing is I just had a grandchild, so that's how long I've been in the federal market. Well, it's great to be back with a firm. One of the things I like about a firm is for the 20 or so years I've been coming to the meetings, I never go away without learning something, and that's what's so great about getting out here like this, and so I appreciate your having me today. Talk about disruptive technology. I mean, the print media is a great example of what that happened. We started our first website. I didn't even know what the web was, but we had a really enthusiastic editor that had been researching it at the time, and he showed me, here's our website. And so that's when I knew things were changing. Sometimes the disruptive technology is an idea, but it takes a long time to germinate. I was looking literally the other day at a video created by the Tribune Company in sometime around 1988, when people didn't have the internet. Not everybody even had PCs then. Not everyone had LANs that far back. And they had this incredibly prescient presentation on the future of newspaper technology, and they showed people using tablets and clicking on things and having it come up, the interactive advertising. This was way before any of us really dreamed this could happen. So it was a great idea. It was just ahead of its time. There wasn't ubiquitous broadband, and the technology for the tablet type of delivery might have been possible, but it wasn't possible in any economical sense. You know, nobody would pay $10,000 for a tablet, but when they came out, now they're $100, and so in today's dollars. So a lot of stuff has been happening. One other thing I just want to commend to your thought. I read an article just yesterday in the Atlantic Monthly, a magazine I've been subscribing to for 40 years, and it's about disruptive technology. And the article described Dick Foster from McKinsey, who in 1986 kind of started this idea, noticing how new technologies from upstart companies would disrupt the old order of things. And he coined the phrase, the age of discontinuity. And he said 30 years later he regrets not using the word disruption because that really became the popular word, which thanks to Clayton Christensen, a Harvard guy, entrepreneur, who developed that phrase, disruptive innovation. And there's some dispute about how disruptive innovation really works and whether it works in all cases, but I think we know enough now to see that it really does happen. So our topic today is disruptive innovation, disruptive technology for government, and we have three really good speakers. Barry West is going to substitute for Alyssa Johnson. She was to be here from the White House, but they're kind of busy there. By the way, it has just been a tremendous, not perfect, but a tremendous and well-intentioned effort that the federal government has been making in this whole Ebola thing. And just now I got an AP bulletin, and maybe you saw it on your phone, that the first nurse in Dallas to have the Ebola is being moved to NIH here in Bethesda, so that she's probably en route now. So tremendous, tremendous effort by at least 8 or 9 government agencies. So if you're connected with any of those agencies, we thank you for the tremendous work you're doing. But Alyssa could not be here, so Barry West is here. He's here at every meeting, ready to jump in. I learned something this morning. You probably all knew it. Barry's PhD is in federal cloud computing. So very impressive. And so that's a disruptive technology. So Barry's a great expert to talk about that. And as you know, Barry is the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation CIO. So Barry, come on up. A credentialed crowd here. Dr. David Bray is he's got a lot of hats. He's the CIO of the FCC. But we want to mention that he's also senior executive with the U.S. intelligence community and executive director with the National Commission for the Review of the Research and Development Programs of the U.S. intelligence community, which is, he's going to be sort of talking from that perspective and from his own perspective and lots of perspectives. Do you fit that on a business card? Dave, come on up. And And Chris Lowe is the Associate Chief Information Officer and the Chief Information Security Officer at the Agriculture Department. Come on up, Chris. He took on that job in September of 2012, and he joined the Office of the CIO back in 2009 as the Associate CIO for Security Operations. And so we're going to kind of have our main focus on cybersecurity and security. Maybe we shouldn't say cyber, but all security, cyber and otherwise. Because it really is it's converging in a situation like what we're seeing with these viruses. You have a cyber component and you have a physical component. So we'll talk about all of that as soon as they get mic'd up. And we don't have all the idea, we don't know everything about all the technologies that are disruptive up here, so we'll hope you'll join us and come up with some questions. Well, all right. I was happy to break 1,000, but I feel like a piker compared to these guys. And half of them are my family, so. Okay, so all of these gentlemen have been dealing in some way or another with the network and the internet for a long time. I mean, there was a time when PCs were not networked, and so I think the networking of things was really the PC revolution. That's when the productivity, the idea of information at your fingertips, Bill Gates' phrase, started to happen. And even then it took 20 years till we saw the productivity revolution from all of that networking. So why don't we start with the idea of the coming network of many things, not just computers, because this is something I think every federal agency is dealing with in one way or another, the sensor-based internet. And so the question then is, maybe you guys could talk about what you see as ways of dealing with the Internet of Things, given the scale and the way that it's going to exponentially increase use of network, creation of data, and so on. Is that making that noise? So I'm going to start with Dr. Bray.
Okay.
Because it was his idea.
I appreciate it. So we knew we're projected to go from having 7 billion network devices in 2013 to 14 billion in 2015 to anywhere between 50 and 200 billion by 2020. So that's clearly exponential change, and we cannot continue to apply linear models. I think the jury is still out about how we're going to handle the cybersecurity of the Internet of Everything, and is this just going to provide a platform for even more very large-scale denial of service attacks using these different devices if they're compromised. I think two things that we need to be thinking about. One is how we shift from an application-specific or infrastructure-specific security model to the data, and because that then allow you to actually, one, be able to actually bring in the data as well as pass back out the data from your organizations to the Internet of Everything. And so actually having controls at the data level, having them actually at the attribute level for the actual data element, as opposed to what we've often done, which is we built a good perimeter around the network, maybe we built it around the database, but we didn't actually get down to the granular elements of the data itself. The second thing that we need to start thinking about is also how do we actually prepare for writing code that should know what it should be doing, or at least what its normal flow should be, and if it's doing something that's abnormal, actually triggering an alert to actually let humans pay attention to it. It might be that the server's down, it might be there's a software bug, but it may also just be someone's trying to do something to code that they're not supposed to. And so it's really trying to make this sort of pivot from being application-specific, infrastructure-specific, to data-specific, regardless of wherever that data is actually stored.
Okay, and Barry, I was trying to think, how could this apply to something like the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation? And what I came up with was the notion that if somehow economic information, financial information, and so on could be greatly expanded for analysis, then maybe the corporation would have a much better insight into what the future demand might be for the services and the cash and so forth that you have to back up.
Yeah, there's actually some of that analysis that goes on now, Tom, but not to the level that we'd be talking with the Internet of Things. But to echo David's point, I think we're going to have to go to a different model as we grow exponentially with devices. As we add IP addresses to every device, there's no way that we can continue the same model of cybersecurity, even if we bring on the continuous monitoring, which I think is a great idea, and it's a shift from where we've been the last 30 years. We've got to come up with some different ways in handling security. It's getting to the point where with the threat level just continuously goes up. Coming back into government after being out for 5.5 years, people ask, well, what's the biggest change? What's different now? Of anything, it's the threat level and the number of attacks that I'm seeing on a daily basis that are out there. So it's for real, and I think it's going to require a different mindset. We're starting to see more and more agencies from the top down, though, really embrace security more. I've seen that since I've come back, where it used to be just the CISO. The CISO can go and do their thing. Now every CIO has to be engaged with cyber and be spending time on it day in and day out. That's a big change. So I think you're going to continue to see that mindset of change in order to handle the Internet of Things as we go forward.
Okay, and Chris, of course, USDA is an information agency, essentially, and so the information assets go back a century, and the analysis, is so useful to so many parts of the economy. I mean, agriculture has a really big footprint.
We do, and some of the systems go back almost as far. I think there's
Miss Lovelace did the programming.
There is a fascinating question, too, when you talk about the Internet of Things and the emerging shadow of data. We are pushing very hard at USDA, as other agencies are, to release data out and, promote its use. But, the open source intel that can be drawn out of now the ability to connect these 100, apparently random facts into a very targeted profile, how do you account for the risk that the aggregate presents that wasn't there when you were dealing with the traditional model? Static systems, static data, fairly known use. I don't know that I have an answer to that yet, but it is a continually, it's a disruptive challenge because it's going to be, only increasing in speed and tempo.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is the idea that there has to be a different way of thinking about it in the head, the mindset. But also backing that up, there has to be a different way to code and create applications that actually take use of this data. And I mean, I saw a tweet today, speaking of tweet, that Hadoop is going to disappear. I didn't read the link, so that's all I can tell you. But that could be bad if you're relying on that for the big data analysis and big data processing.
Well, I mean, I do think you're right that we need to have a new way of thinking it. In fact, what I try to encourage is thinking about it, shifting from talking about security to talking about resiliency that actually includes security. But it's also thinking about continuity of operations. It's also just recognizing that if you're on the internet, you can try and do the best you can. You can try and actually have the most recent controls, the most recent patches, but we're always going to have sort of zero-day surprises. I mean, that's just the nature of what we're dealing with. And so in some respects, it's almost like the analogy of when you get in a car, you are going to try and buckle your safety belt, have anti-lock brakes, and have airbags, and do all you can to be a good driver, but you still could get hit by another car while driving. And so it's really just what can you do to sort of reduce that risk as much as possible, make sure it's appropriate to the sensitivity of the data that's being exchanged, obviously have encryption and data at rest as well as in transit, but shifting more to the model that higher walls and tougher locks will keep anything bad from ever happening to that this is informed, we're driving on the road, but we recognize that even on the road, still bad things could happen.
Okay, well, let's try to get this down to earth a little bit more and talk about a practical problem that I think a lot of agencies are facing. And this came up yesterday at a panel that we had at the radio station, as a matter of fact. And that is all agencies have to do continuous monitoring, and we have a CDM, continuous diagnostics and mitigation subset of all of that happening. And at the same time, so much data is moving to cloud providers. So what agencies I hear are dealing with is how do we do continuous monitoring and CDM when we are not directly touching the data center that it is we have to protect. So there doesn't seem to be an easy tech solution out there to that.
Yeah. So I think that would really start with the procurement aspect. And what are you building into your contracts, such as service level agreements for those vendors, and being very detailed about what you're going to expect and having detailed timelines built in as you go forward. And that really hasn't happened as much I've seen in the last 4 to 5 years as people have just got on the cloud bandwagon. They really haven't thought a lot of that through, but I think we're starting to see somewhat of a change, and it really starts with the procurement office and really getting them educated.
So, but there's a product that'll do that? Is that what is there technology that'll do that?
It's part of the term. So
Yeah.
like when you write the procurement package, you
Yeah.
say, we expect these are the things that you're going to be doing security-wise. At the same time, you can also say in your contract, we do expect that you will allow us, if you're working with DHS, to do the scans. And in some respects, actually, I feel more comfortable going to a cloud-based provider because if they truly have economy of scale, especially for small agencies, they're going to be investing much more in their IT security because they're larger than a lot of the small agencies can. But you do need to write in the terms and actually say, you need to actually have these security practices in place, you need to have these controls, you need to be able to do these scans. And then also, you can also say, you need to be able to give us near real-time audit feeds as to what's going on with our data in your cloud, so that our own security operations center can actually be monitoring that feed as well.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge, and we've had the experience where we've had a cloud provider, look at us and say, you realize, the composite of all federal government traffic in our business is less than 1%. Trying to say, yes, but we really need these extra controls that no one else is asking for is a tough conversation.
Yeah.
It is, but I think that's where it may be for individual organizations, and you're right. If you're going to a large cloud provider, even then we still may be less or 1 or 2%. But that will also create a niche. Now that's also then where we have to go back to Congress and say, look, yes, you can move to cloud for certain purposes, for bulk file storage and email, and maybe you get actually a downward price. But in other cases, if I need to actually have these security controls in place and I need to actually create this niche for this market that actually is being asked for these additional demands, it may not actually be a reduction in price to move to cloud services. In fact, it might be at the same price, if not a little bit more, because we need these additional controls for public service purposes.
Okay. Do we have a question from any of the tables? Disruptive technology.
Well, I would just say, would you
Stacey.
think that would be a short-term price reduction, possibly, maybe with some scaling down over time?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just recognizing that, well, and the other thing is also cost avoidance on my part, that if I had to impose all the controls that a large cloud provider can do for their data sets, I would end up probably consuming upwards of more than 50%, 60% of my IT budget for the purpose of security and not actually getting things done.
Yeah.
And so it's just sort of having that conversation about what we're really trying to do when we're moving to the cloud is greater resiliency, greater scalability if something pops up and we need to scale quickly, greater agility if we need to actually do something on the fly. We'll look for effectiveness and efficiencies when we actually want to try and do that, but in some cases it's also you're paying a premium because government does have additional requirements for how you actually protect that data.
And Amazon, they went through that. I mean, they're now hosting many of the three-lettered agencies because they did do that investment early on and bit the bullet. And now, many agencies are leveraging them because they're ahead of the curve.
And we should be able to benefit from the first early adopters.
Yeah, and one of the things one of the cloud providers said was that, well, this agency has these 30 controls they care about. This agency has 30 controls. Maybe they have 20 of them in common. Can they get the 30 in common and leverage everybody's controls with that cloud provider, which drives everybody's costs down? Doable?
Oh, and in fact, I think in general, that's what you're seeing with the trends with continuous, CDM is actually moving that direction of actually let's identify what's industry best practices. So it's not just unique to government, but this is actually what industry best practices are.
Okay. Disruptive thoughts. Sir.
So just a question for Dr. Bray, since we're also in the intelligence community. We've been talking about cyber defense and cyber security. Where are we going as a country in our intel in the cyber offensive manner instead of, like you said, trying to build the wall so high and trying to tag data so that we have security on that level? I mean, we seem to be behind the curve in terms of where our offense is.
Okay, the question was, what is our posture as a country with respect to the intelligence community, I guess in military also, with cyber offensive?
Right. So that's where I first would preface and say that actually the introduction of me being with the National Commission, that was in a past role. So I'm actually talking about that being in a past role. The other thing is I think what you're looking at is the general trend of how we opened with, PCs initially were not connected to the internet. In fact, the internet wasn't around. And now we're actually going to another role where actually personnel are not just connecting to PCs within the firewall of your organization. So in general, we're dealing with basically anywhere, anytime, anyone can basically touch any data anywhere. And so that's just sort of an interesting dramatic shift, and it's only going to get even more exponential in the shifts we're going to see. We all wear many different hats. When the National Commission we released our report last year, there is an unclassified version. One of the things they talk about is we need to understand more how science and technology capabilities will disrupt and surprise us, because then we can actually get prepared. The challenge is that we know that this curve is going up exponential, and so how far can you project in the future given that things, everyone seems to be looking about 3 years or less is what they basically has concluded. And so how do we plan for those really long-term sort of surprises, 5 years, 8 years from now, when maybe you've got machine learning, and machine learning is so good that when paired with a human, it can actually outperform the security that a human professional could do. At what time do you need to actually also work at, if we become so reliant on machine learning to actually sort of provide the infrastructure for society, how do you know if that algorithm has not been compromised or not in some very subtle way? So I think it's more, how do we get sort of solving that sort of defense in depth approach? Again, the idea that where we're going is going to look dramatically different than we are now, with just the explosion of network devices. And how do you actually begin to make sense between that signal of noise, given that there is so many things going on? What I would say, again, not wearing my FCC hat, but wearing the past role that I had in the past, it may be that we need to make a shift from approaching it as being higher walls, tougher locks, to almost seeing it's almost like epidemiology. And so if you think about it, with epidemiology, we try to encourage good hygiene. We try to encourage vaccinations, antibiotics, and everything you can do to try and avoid catching a disease. But we still recognize that outbreaks will occur. And when outbreaks occur, then it's about rapid detection, trying to identify where the source is, can you contain it, and can you mitigate it and clean it up as quickly as possible. That is a big shift from how we've approached security in the past, and it would actually require cybersecurity as a field to become much more data-driven, metrics-driven, than right now it's much more best practices and anecdotes. Hope that helps.
Okay, Chris, when you look out at the landscape as the CISO from that hat, I wanted to ask you, we hear the idea of defense in depth. We've heard for many years. I think it started in DOD, but it's pretty much everybody's idea. How does that square with the idea of resilience? Or does defense in depth give you resilience, or is it the opposite of resilience?
Well, it's a good question first, because you're driving the protection point down from the old model of, bastion high walls and guarded gates, down to not just the device, maybe the mobile device or pocket, but actually the code running. The challenge is, as these, the internet blog, you refer to as the internet of other people's things, right? You're dealing with the risk of your device talking to another device that isn't your control. You really need the awareness at that code level or at that data piece level, but it also needs to be aware of the context, where it's being pulled from one device to, a different system and a different context. For example, for USDA, crop production reports, fairly interesting as general awareness in USDA. Important when you talk about insurance programs and who's dealing with risk. Essential when you're talking about market predictions about to be released after a timed embargo. Same piece of data, 3 different contexts, 3 different risk models. So it's really a question of how do you deal with that, as it's migrating back and forth. It's never a single static thing. So is that resilience? No, didn't really answer that question, right? It is going to depend on where you find it and how you deal with it. I think a big part of it is shifting how we think about and how we deal with the risk. When we talk about what is it we're concerned about, it has to be a continuous triage model. It needs to be what are we, I tell my staff, it's like if you're ever in a swimming pool, you have a little pH checking chart that says, these are the high value issues we're dealing with. You're going to measure against these and deal with whatever is emerging based on where that overall risk of high value assets are. That takes us to a point of knowing when something hits, dealing with just at least the most important, and dealing with how we recover. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to prevent. We're going to focus on how we repair, how we recover, how we inform management of what has been breached or now needs to be cleaned up. It changes my function a lot because we're spending a lot more time on that remediation activity.
Sure.
And I love the context. Context matters, and oftentimes we lose that. The other thing is I do think it actually helps with resiliency because with a submarine, if a part of the submarine gets compromised, you're able to compartmentalize and actually contain it. So actually, if you do this defense in depth, you're actually working on a strategy of compartmentalization. The entire ship doesn't go down. Just a little part that actually was affected is flooded.
Okay, I'm going to use the Internet of Things and cloud computing to extend my parking time.
You hope you are.
I hope I am. I don't know. In the district, anything is possible. So I'm going to add an hour. Yeah, good. There you go. And I got another hour and 15 minutes to go. Isn't that great? This is the Internet of Things in a practical manner and disruptive technology. It disrupts the meter maids, and that's always a good thing. Barry, a question I had for you is in the area of resilience and recovery and the whole cyber issue is cloud mobility. I don't mean mobile devices, but I mean the mobility of provider to provider, because that's a big concern a lot of agencies have. I think it was the Labor Department that got caught with the failure, the business failure of a cloud computing provider just in recent weeks.
Yeah.
And they've got to pay all this money to get their own data out. But people are saying, it's like the Roach Motel. You can check in, but you can't check out of the cloud.
Yeah. So what we're doing at PVGC is we go to bring your own device, and which we're one of the pilot agencies that have been doing that. But with our phones, is we're using container software for all of our emails. So even when we issue the iPhone, you're not just getting in, and we're not allowing the users to download their applications. They actually have to go through a container. And there's many different types of containers out there depending on what device you get, whether it be the Samsung or the iPhone. And so far that seems to be working well. So I think you're going to see more and more of that used, that container type setup, but it has to be managed. You have to get all the parties involved in the acquisition on board up front for cost and things like that.
What I meant was, though, if you say you choose a cloud provider and you really go with them, that's a major partner to your federal operation once you're in that cloud.
Yep.
Suppose you want to skip Cloud A, you want to end that relationship and move everything to Cloud B.
Again, it gets back to what I said earlier about the service level agreement and what you've done as far as your homework up front and going into that cloud arrangement. How do you have the exit strategy? Are you going to be able to do that legally? But it's a great question.
I was thinking in other realms they call that a prenuptial.
Right. You don't want to be you don't want to be in a situation like I think it was EPA or one where they're actually now having to pay for their own data to get their own data back.
Right, I think it was labor.
Labor?
Maybe EPA also, I don't
Yeah.
know. Anyone from EPA here? Yeah, we get a head nod from EPA.
So it was EPA, okay. So I think you really have to do your homework up front. And again, it's coming back to that contract and how well you've written the contract up front to allow for that.
All right, so we're living in a totally different technological environment than we were a few years ago. And it really is different. I mean, I think we are in a third way. I remember when the mini computer was the disruptor of the mainframe. I mean, this is in our lifetimes this happened. So we're on what I call a fourth wave, if you will. And so I guess my question is, what are the, let me see if I can frame this the right way. The overall cyber look, the way we deal with cyber in a world that is totally mobile, totally cloud, is the guidance that the government gives through NIST and through the other guidance bodies. There's about 3 different competing ones. Is that sufficient for this new model of computing that seems to be taking over? I mean, NIST has cloud guidance, and they have mobility guidance, and they have, I don't know whether they have guidance on switching cloud providers and getting that up front into the SLA, but I wonder if the guidance and the current doctrine, if you will, really covers the way computing is going.
So I would first applaud and say, actually, that we've actually come a long way with getting good guidance out. But like all things, as technology continues to progress, there's going to be new things that we need to get additional guidance on. You hit one already, which is it's probably good to actually have best practices for when you write contracts to have an exit strategy, that prenup for when you actually need to pull your data out. Also, it would be good to actually have guidance and actually work with, communicate a consolidated, hopefully single government voice as to how do we expect feeds from cloud providers to be fed into Security Operations Center, so we don't have to actually have this agency have a different one than this one, that it can actually be a common way of getting those feeds in. The other thing is, this may be the third or fourth wave. There obviously will be another wave after this of something else. And that to me actually gets interesting, is can we actually start thinking about what's coming next? If I could suggest what's coming next, it's right now, you go to Google, you go to Facebook, you go to Amazon, you go and set your preferences for what data you want to keep private, what data you want to share with the public, but it's actually, you have to go to each of the different sort of platforms and set your preferences. What would be nice is if in the future, both organizations and individuals actually have a sort of way of saying, here are the things that I want to maintain and share, here are the things that I'm okay with keeping with my friends, keeping with my families, but it's actually the user controls that, and then there's actually a negotiation with the platform that says, here's what the user's existing preferences are, so you don't have to go to 10 different platforms and actually set that. It actually gets the control back in the hands of the actual individual as to basically do unto others as they would permit you to do unto them in some respects.
That's kind of like a prenuptial too, I guess.
Yes.
Comments?
I think one thing too that it hasn't been talked about a lot, but current numbers of cloud usage are in the single digits still. Skip down the road 5 years, 10 years, you're talking 50, 70, 80, whatever that target is. What becomes of the architecture question? As agencies are spreading out to put systems hosted at different sites, different clouds, the ability to then talk about meaningful, new development, new integration is going to be, very much dependent on an architecture that may not exist. At USDA, we are 29 agencies and offices. We do not act as one body. What a surprise in government, right? But the challenge remains, you still have to know where the data assets are and where they're being stored and how they're being handled if you're going to try and build something like a unifying software over top of them. And a lot of that is not in the guidance. It's sort of assumed your traditional architecture model will keep up.
And with that, actually, and it's interesting, we just had a conversation about this morning at the FCC. I mean, what we're looking at is, can we take our existing client-server systems and as we move them to the cloud, modularize them into repeatable business processes, so if we want to later remix them using APIs, we can do that. But it's not just a straight lift and shift of this single system is now in the cloud. It's actually been atomized into different modular parts, and now we have a service catalog so that when someone has a new need, we could say, well, could we stitch this together almost like a quilt? And from that, actually produce a new system without having to do wholesale and buy a new system altogether. But that's new, and that's actually a conversation that actually should start happening in the next year or two across the different government agencies.
I mean, in some ways, that's an old holy grail. That goes back to the object-oriented programming days. Blobs, remember blobs?
Widgets.
So I'm dating myself.
You mentioned NIST, and are they keeping up? And a lot of their special publications, Tom, can take up to 18 months to actually go through the entire vetting process. But I think they've done an excellent job of setting the basic framework, whether it be around the cloud definition, whether it be around the risk management framework. I think they've done a really good job, but I think it's really going to be up to a lot of the agencies to really move a lot of that quicker along, especially with the Internet of Things and some of the other technologies as they come along. Keep pace.
Agreed.
Okay, good. All right. There were all these tables discussing disruptive technology. No one has a question for the panel.
Got one over there.
Peg.
I was at a conference last week in San Diego talking about emerging technologies, did a show of hands. No one over 30 had a wearable device of any kind, and everyone under 30 did,
A wearable device.
a wearable device. And when you think about bringing new technologies into government, how are we engaging those millennials, the younger people that are bringing that kind of thinking?
Okay, so the question is, does the government have a technological environment that's attractive to the people that are, I guess, the digital natives, the people that wear technology? That means you mean like those watches?
Watches.
The watches, yeah. Or, I guess, could wrap around any body part, I guess, as time goes on. But,
Could even,
but, I mean,
could even be, yeah, you could even be wearing it on your ear.
that's right. I'm recording everything. Talk about that.
Well, I think that points to that our role, I often say my role as CIO is first and foremost 80% people, 20% technology. I have to be that digital diplomat that actually creates that culture that actually encourages people to come here, which is, again, first thing I would say is Dilbert is funny because it's universal. So as much as we lament government having bureaucracy, it's interesting. I actually go to private sector CIOs and they actually said, I wish I actually had some of the mechanisms you had. They actually like the fact that we actually have FISMA. They wish they actually had equivalent of that in the private sector because then actually could actually address some of the things and actually bring rationalization to it. At the same time, the founders actually intended for certain processes to have a sort of checks and balances to them as a way of actually preventing the rise of the king. That works well until we're now in this exponential era where we do need to change exponentially. I mean, wearable devices, I believe there are right now 19 million wearable devices in 2015. It's going to go upwards of 250 million or more by 2020. And so you're right. What happens when you bring that into a military facility? What happens when you bring it into an intelligence community facility? How do we address that? I recommend that we actually start thinking now about how do we embrace this, because we can't put Pandora's box back in. And in fact, it may even be that this could actually aid you in your job. It could actually say, I see you're working on this type of task. Did you know that somebody else at a similar part of the organization or even another government agency is working on a similar task? I'd like to recommend you work with them. Now, the other thing you could also be doing is actually learn your patterns. And so if normally you work Monday through Friday, certain hours, and all of a sudden now you're in the place at 11 p.m. and you usually do mission, but now you're going through financial information, that might not be you. That might be someone pretending to be you. So it could be both a collaborative tool, but it also, again, getting that defense in depth, it's now learned sort of the patterns that are associated with what you do.
I don't think government does a good job with innovation, period. So to leverage
We're going to change that, though.
David's point, it's definitely going to be up to the CIOs to be the thought leaders around that. We don't have an incubator. We don't have a Google environment where we can have our government people go one day a week and do nothing but experiment with technology. It's going to take the CIOs embracing it and really having it as a priority as we go forward.
And if I can make one plug and say, since this is a firm and we've got industry representatives too, at the end of the day, we will do the best we can to try and change the existing system, recognizing it's got controls. But there's also a role for industry to say that we also need our government partners to be innovative, and therefore we're advocating for things such as this space and things like that. If just we say we want to do it, it sounds like it's self-promoting.
Right.
But if people
Has to
say
be a
this is actually the
partnership.
good of the nation, this actually benefits the nation, then it actually has a louder voice.
And Chris, what are the grand challenges you see at agriculture, basically in the cyberspace, but in the larger data space? What would you like industry to talk to you about?
What they're doing. I would slightly disagree that we're not doing R&D. We are. They're just not telling the CISO or the CIO about it.
Unless you're on an R&D commission, and then they know.
So, and I think that is one of my challenges for the day. If I had the instrument to deal with that, I would like some kind of risk quitclaim to say, in this space, we're going to allow this to work without having to run every FISMA control across it. That we can just deal with this as it's new tech, emerging technology, hopefully disruptive, in a space that doesn't mean I apply all the rules to all the things all the time. Right now, I don't have that latitude.
And it's also, I mean, it also needs to be a conversation, you know, right now we're in a place where risk is discouraged because anyone who takes a risk, if that risk doesn't turn out, and the whole point of disruption is not everything will succeed. If everything will succeed, it's not disruptive, it's a sure thing, and it's probably incremental, if anything, or maybe not even changing. So risk will not always succeed, but how do we create that culture where it's okay to take a risk, not have it turn out well, but that doesn't mean the end of your career?
Well, let me ask a specific question. How are we doing on time? We okay? Who's the boss here? Barry is, I think.
5 minutes.
Amelia, where are you? All right, we'll keep going.
10 more.
10, okay. There's a seemingly simple issue, yet it's really vexing for government, for industry, and for private individuals, and that is authentication and ID management. Now, Jeremy Grant at NIST is doing some great work, just got some grants out to try to start operationalizing and developing some of the ideas, but we are pretty much stuck in the same model of authentication and ID management that we were in 1975, 1985. And so what's your thinking about where you would like to see that go?
Yeah.
We have encryptions, we have certificates, we have all this stuff, we have thumbprint on the phone and all this.
I think we actually have made progress, Tom. I mean, PKI, I would agree, that's been around since 1970, and the guys at NIST are still doing their algorithms.
Nobody can ever explain what it is.
They can explain what it is. But I think, especially over the last 5 years, I think we've made some tremendous leaps and bounds in progress around authentication as far as device management, getting things smaller, actually getting people on board with carrying cards, and whether it be a PIV card or what have you, an initiative that started 10 years ago.
The HSPD.
Yes,
card.
12. So I think we've actually made some really good progress, and I think companies, private sector, has done a tremendous job in trying to offer new platforms and devices as well.
Yes? You
So,
agree?
well, I would definitely agree. I think while it may not look like it, it's almost like we're setting the stage for that sort of tectonic shift when it happens. The tectonic shift, I think, will be twofold. One will be any eventual identity management solution actually has to be used in the private sector as well. Again, that idea that we're just a pretty small footprint relative to the larger picture. So obviously we've seen big companies try and take this on, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, they've each tried to take it on in different flavors. That's where I applaud the approach that we're actually looking for a industry-wide solution, not a government niche solution. But the other tectonic shift, and the question of when that will happen, maybe 2 years, maybe 6 years, when is it that we actually start moving towards a model of where it's actually you're not hired by individual organizations' HR departments, but you're led into public service at the federal level overall, and then that actually gives you the mobility that we know that Gen Y is going to want, which is they're going to probably want to move across different government agencies on a much more regular basis than we've seen in the past. And so you're hired for public service versus you're hired for Department of Commerce versus Department of Agriculture or something like that. That's a really big change. And that's not an IT change. That's a organizational HR change. But that's what needs to happen for that final IT piece to come into play.
Okay, so it's still a ways off.
I don't know. I think at a certain point in time, especially if budget pressures still exist, one might say, why are we paying for different HR mechanisms in different departments and agencies? Maybe this is actually a budgetary measure that also moves us into the forward of Gen Y is going to expect, I can do mobility. I don't have to wait 9 months to apply for a job at a different government agency and then move over there.
Okay.
Would that be true for industry as well?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think what the statistics show is that Gen Y in general will be loyal to a profession, but they are also expected to be highly mobile and move about every 2 years to different places where they're working because they want that different variety. And we actually, that can be our value proposition for public service. I mean, the thing we did not talk about with cybersecurity is we have obviously GS pay scales. And so it's really hard to attract a really talented, dedicated cybersecurity professional to choose to take the pay cut to work in public service. But what we can try and do is say, one, give us 3 to 5 years of your time. We'll give you, instead of an IPO, we'll give you a reverse IPO, opportunity for a positive impact, a sense of mission. And then if you want to go from that position and go into the next place and say, look, I did some really hard security work, I did my public service work, and I want to go to private sector, we'll help that. But it's about setting those on-ramps and off-ramps so we can attract that talent And maybe it's not they're doing it for their entire career, but they're coming in for 5 to 6 years, giving their best, and then it's other people coming in and out.
Yeah, I think there is precedent for that. You see it more and more at some of the CIO forums in the commercial sector, that government credibility can take you into the private sector and not always the other way around.
Right.
I think, too, part of the challenge that we're working with, we just finished up working with OPM on the workforce study for cyber, and so we actually have a pretty good thumbprint of who's working cyber, but that almost becomes a cliche, because if you're full-time cyber, then you're still outside the people that are doing the business, doing the mission. What our challenge becomes is, how do we take the thousands of IT workers that exist in our organization and have them, matrixed into security responsibilities? Government has a very hard time understanding matrix.
It's not designed to do it well.
No. And yet, the best IT censor is the system admin who says, that's weird. It's that security as part of day-to-day operations, as part of what you think about when you want to do new activities in a mission, when you want to have new procurements, building that in rather than being an external group that is going to come audit you and, much like OIG has to live with, right? And be that external force to try and drive you to better behavior. That's a different flavor challenge under HR, and there's a reason why I refer to things as moving in HR speed.
And I think it's also worth asking is, how can we make it go even one step further? It's not just the IT admin, it's also the programmatic elements of a department and agency. I mean, security in the end should be everyone's responsibility because it's part of public trust. It's also about protecting privacy. It's also about protecting civil liberties and personal freedoms. That said, I mean, how many of us, when we sign up for a new app, we get that 10 to 20 page, user agreement, and we just click accept, and we actually don't take the time to read all the terms and conditions? How can we actually distill it so that understanding security is not a 10 to 20 page document? It is much easier for someone in programmatic element to understand their role in protecting privacy, protecting security, protecting civil liberties.
Okay. Question in the back. Yeah, sir. Oh, okay.
Institutional change, and here we are talking about disruptive technologies and innovation. What, if any, are the trigger points where an agency, not an R&D shop, not a grant shop, not a place that like S&T or PHS, what would be a trigger that would allow you to, or encourage you to take risks with an innovative and disruptive technology, bring it in and try to solve some problems, as opposed to dig a hole in front of them?
Yes, so the question was, what is the trigger that would cause an agency to go with something risky and not the traditional means, because or just try it out, yeah. But in other words, but there's a trigger point based on some pressing situation, maybe, or challenge.
So I guess my own thoughts is actually was what Clay Christensen actually said when he wrote about the innovator's dilemma. If things are going okay, maybe they're not great, but they're going okay, it's really hard to be an innovator, because why are you trying to move people's cheese? But when something breaks or things are just so bad, that's actually the right opportunity to actually say, well, let's actually look at doing something different, because clearly what we've been doing in the past is not succeeding. And so I don't know if I've intentionally or unintentionally done this. I tend to go to places where things are at the point where we actually can admit, okay, we can't keep on doing what we're doing because that's not working for us. And that actually gives you the opportunity then to say, well, let's do something dramatically different. Let's have that rational conversation and say, what's the next round of where we need to go? I think that's not unique to government. I think that's also in the private sector too. Established companies, if they're making a profit and they're getting along okay, what's their incentive to try and change? Because that's risk and it might disrupt where you are. So I guess that's both the opportunity with exponential change, is quickly our models will not work in either the private sector or the public sector. But it also means you're going to need to actually reward people brave enough to say, I'm going to parachute in that circumstance. I know that there's some, there's some fires around me. There may be some scorched earth. But we will try and figure out a rational way to actually move forward from this and go forward together.
Other thoughts from the panel on that one?
It's around kicking the tires before you buy it, right? You want that extra, I think that's where you're going. Yeah, what models can work for government? If we can set up, again, I go back to procurement, if we can set up relationships and contractual agreements that allow us to bring something in for 60, 90 days, it makes it a lot easier without making that commitment up front to buy the product.
Try before you buy.
Follow up to that. Where I'm going with this is, years ago, what at least was a pivotal point in cyber was the big big. And all these technologies came out everywhere, big emphasis on cyber.
Okay.
Again, I think it's, at a certain point in time, you have to have enough people that say, our existing model is not working, I'm feeling pain. It's almost like Hobbes saying, Hobbes' philosophy was people are not prone to change when they're happy. So the question is, when do we get unhappy enough that we need to change how we're doing things? And that's actually an opportunity for innovation. And then it's also just thinking about, well, what is that next pivot? Is it recognizing that it's not just about tighter locks, tougher walls, but actually approaching it much more like resiliency and approaching it much more like, how do I make it so it's as less risky as possible to drive the car, but I still have that. And it's going to have to come from both industry and government. It can't just be a single solution from us.
Okay, do we have time for one last quick question from Gloria?
Couple of quick things. I like hearing you say that the car scenario, but if you look at that scenario versus what you're talking about in government, in the car industry, they're constantly trying to be proactive to fix the car so that they do things to keep accidents from happening. In government, we're saying we're going to let the accident happen and then we're going to react. And that's what we do. I mean, we can say we try to be proactive, but we're not. We are afraid to take the risk and do things new and different, or even look at innovative
Sure.
technologies that are new and different, because
Okay.
everybody's scared to take the risk. So I think one of the things I was going to say earlier, I've had my hand raised 5 times, Tom.
Well, you're in a shadow down there. There's a light in my face.
But one thing that I think is very important that we haven't really said is that mission people need to be involved with the technology people and the CISOs to discuss and to work through security issues together, because the mission people are the ones who really want that information and data protected to the nth degree, and the CISOs are there to support that. I don't think that's the way it's working. I think, and generally speaking, the CISOs and CIOs are saying to the mission people, here's what I'm going to do for you, period. And the mission people are not involved in looking at what's innovative and what the real proactive solutions are.
All right,
Well,
so we
and I
have
think-
stovepipes and silos. We're going to have to wrap it up.
I recognize, but I just want to sort of see, actually, I think it was great what she said, which was CEOs or organizational leaders, mission leaders, are not right now putting cybersecurity high on their radar. That's partly because we actually have a really bad way of actually explaining what's the return on investment. If I spend 2% of my budget, 5% of my budget, 10% of my budget, am I now twice as protected? We
Yeah.
can't actually have that justification.
That's
other
the
thing that-
opposite of the risk management approach.
But the other thing that I would also say is, while I understand that right now we're not doing the seatbelt model and everything like that, seatbelts were only coming into fashion in the 1970s. And that was only because enough public consciousness reached the level they actually demanded that I am not going to buy a car if it doesn't have seatbelts. And so the question is, what can we do to actually make it so that the mission is advocating for, you need to have seatbelts, you need to have airbags. It's not the IT people saying you need to do this. It's actually, it's demand, and it's customer demand to do that.
And
That's
remember,
how you
there's
see
one
us do
part
it.
of the car you can never make safe. That's the nut behind the wheel.
Exactly.
All right.
Perfect system.
I think we're going to conclude there.
Yep.
David Bray, thank you.
Thank
Chris
you.
Lowe, Barry West, give him a round of applause.
All right, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you to all of you for your engagement today. We appreciate this unique opportunity to hear our esteemed government, academic, and industry colleagues. Listen up, please. We're going to wrap it up. Just give me 5 minutes. Appreciation to our program committee champions, Anelia, Stacy, Gary, Craig, and our October program team for spearheading today's program. Special thanks to the champion of a firm's video initiative, Ken Wright in the back, owner of Wright Image, and to Craig Chapman. Thank you. Watch it too. I would also like to thank a firm's communications team, the PMR team in the back for orchestrating today's event, and to the Clyde staff. I thought they did a great job for their hospitality. We can't do any of our valuable programs without our generous sustaining partners. As I said earlier, we're up to over 60 sustaining partners. Any of you that aren't members, please sign up. It's not that much to join. It's based on your company size, so I encourage you to join. partners, all of whom help to make Affirm and the educational programs possible. We want to thank and encourage others to get involved and to support this great organization. As a reminder, kindly complete the feedback form. Include your name and contact information as we'll draw from the forms and select the winners to attend our next event. Also complete the call for volunteers, as Affirm is eager to engage our members in program outreach and communications. As a reminder, we actually do have another event tonight. We're partnering with the Cyber Smoke Group. We're calling it the After Hours Rocktoberfest. It's actually going to be at Morton's on Connecticut Avenue. We have about 350 people so far confirmed, but please come out. You don't need pre-registration to attend. It's free. November 3rd, we're actually having our golf tournament. Is Tom Ragland here today? I don't think Tom made it. But we are making really good strides with our sponsorships for the golf, so please get involved. We'd love to see you come out on November 3rd for our 7th Annual Turkey Shoot Golf Classic. And we still have openings for golfers. November 18th is our Affirm and GuiTech Present Information Technology, Catalyst for Innovation, Accelerator for Change. We're partnering with GuiTech, so please put that on the agenda as well. And again, thanks to our speakers that came out today, Dr. David Bray and Chris Lowe, as well as our moderator, Temin. Great job.